Today we have Jim Leary, and he is a native of Rice Lake, and he's a scholar of Scandinavian Studies and a retired professor from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He received his bachelor's in literature and from the University of Notre Dame, and his master's in folklore from the University of North Carolina, a PhD in folklore and American studies from Indiana University. His research focuses on the folklore of the upper Midwest, especially Scandinavian Americans, which we don't have any of them around here, indigenous and migrant people, rural and working class people. Jim, we don't do that at all. Jim has received many awards and accolades, has written many journal articles and books. He's researched and helped produce several folklife festivals, museum exhibits, documentaries, sound recordings, and films. And he was a co-founder of the Center for the Study of Upper Midwestern Cultures. We've worked with them on some things. It's a fabulous organization. I suppose it's actually part of the UW-Madison.
Yeah.
Okay. And he's even been nominated for several Grammy Awards. So, today he's talking about folklore and how we can use it, how we can gather it and use it in our museum.
Thanks for the long introduction, and great to see a full room. And does everyone have one, this set of handouts that okay, and when Tammy has your email address, I've got electronic copies of all of those, because some of them are templates that I've used and other folklorists have used for photo logs and interview logs and stuff like that, and it's a kind of a basic form. Just Tammy invoked the Center for the Study of Upper Midwestern Cultures, and this was established with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities in about 2000, something like that. And we're a coalition of folklorists and linguists, and we do cultural documentation with diverse peoples and linguistic documentation with diverse peoples throughout Wisconsin and the upper Midwest. We partner with local organizations, we do public programs, and we create accessible online archival collections. And I've been doing field research, cultural documentation for more than 50 years. Mostly in Wisconsin. I've also worked a lot in the UP in northern lower Michigan, and in Minnesota on the Iron Range, and in various other communities. I did a project on Minnesota polka bands about 30 years ago or something like that. And pretty much all of these projects, these are folks, Croatians from southeast Wisconsin, a Belgian guy from southern Door County, some Swedes from just south of Ashland, a couple of Finns right here and here, some Polish ladies singing Polish hymns, a wild Norwegian playing dobro, Hawaiian lap steel guitar with horns on his head, and some of you may remember the singing Tills from Tills Hills over near Cumberland, doing these kind of Austrian alpine music.
So can I say something real quick? Even if you haven't heard of the singing Tills, you've probably heard of John Till, the plaster doctor.
Yes.
This is his son,
This
right?
is his son,
Oh.
yes, the son of the plaster doctor. And so I've done some of this documentary work on my own, but a lot of it has been for different organizations. Done a lot of stuff with the Chippewa Valley Museum. I've worked with the Wisconsin Arts Board, the Wisconsin Historical Society, the Cedarburg Cultural Center, the John Michael Kohler Arts Center, Wisconsin Humanities Council, and a whole lot of other organizations. And fundamentally, this work has been funded by partnerships between local, state, federal funds, which, as you may know, have diminished in recent years. And I think Wisconsin's the only worst state for public funding of arts and humanities in the United States is Mississippi. I think we're 29th, which means I've done a lot of this, I mean, I do it anyway on a shoestring, as have most organizations. But we live in an incredibly rich region, and the work I've done over the years has always resulted in different kinds of public programs directly involving the people I've documented. So this is a film I produced with my students and Local 383 of the Ironworkers Union on the kind of cultural practices and stories of their trade. I worked for many years on contract with the Smithsonian Institution on their annual Folklife Festival, which this year is not on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. It's touring. There'll be different iterations of it in different places. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, I co-produced a series for Wisconsin Public Radio called Down Home Dairyland, traditional and ethnic music of Wisconsin and the upper Midwest. My wife and I did the field work back in the mid-'80s for the first folk arts survey of Wisconsin, which was produced by the John Michael Kohler Arts Center with a catalog, and then it toured to various places around the state. Are you going to get the lights in the front here? Or?
I could. They all go out if I turn them out.
Oh, I see. Can you see this all right, or is it kind of pushed down?
Yeah.
You can see it. Okay, good. This is kind of a cool. I got a great. I'm not a performer, but I'm a producer. So we found all 28 78 RPM records issued by the Helvetia label, which was started by a Swiss immigrant in Monroe, Wisconsin in the early 1920s, and cleaned up the sound, and I found out information about all of these people. It included two people from this region, Otto Ringlesbacher, who ran the Buckhorn Tavern in Rice Lake for many years, and a guy named Carl Hoppe, who lived partly in Rice Lake and partly in Chippewa Falls, who was a band director in the early 20th century. And this is an anthology of jokes and humorous anecdotes. And there's a lot of stuff from the upper Midwest, because I went to see old neighbors and my dad and people like that I'll talk about a little bit.
And Lena?
Ole and Lena, among other things, yeah. And all of this work has resulted in the creation of lots of cultural documentation. Sometimes it's acquiring rare artifacts like sound recordings. This is the Helvetia label, which then we try to digitize and clean up the sound. But maybe it's hard to see. Here are some cassettes from early field recordings I made. You know, black and white photos, handwritten notes, typed in reports and lots of files. And so I'm very much interested in not only doing thorough cultural documentation with good sound, good information, good images, but also and creating public programs, but also conserving that documentary material in an organized way so that it can be of use to further researchers, but also can be repurposed for other kinds of public programs and productions. Because if you get good material and conserve it, you know, it can last and be reused in different ways. And one of the things that we've done, and here's some folks from the Hagen area, members of the Tomish family. Their folks were Czech or Bohemian immigrants. We created a website in partnership with the music library at UW-Madison called Local Centers Global Sounds, and on it we have freely accessible for viewing and downloads, because we've gotten releases from people. We have field reports, we have sound recordings, we have images, and there's thousands of them organized through different discrete collections, but searchable as well. So that's called.
That's available for people to use. Do they have to pay?
No, it's freely available. You have to, if you're going to use any of the stuff, you have to cite the stuff appropriately, and we appreciate knowing about it because, you know, like everything else in institutions, you have to compete, and if you've got you know, hits on your site or uses in productions, that helps you make the case to, you know, to stay afloat. And we've kind of built this. Started out with me writing a little grant so we could create a sound lab and convert older sound recordings in cassette formats and audio, you know, reel tape into digital formats, and also scan images. And then we wrote more grants so we could start putting this up, and then people started bringing us collections, and you know, and so we've added to staff through grants, and then leveraged that and established ourselves, and then we've gotten permanent fund, you know. So it's anyway. That's why I retired after a while. I was constantly doing this kind of hustling. But yes, this is a resource that's out there, and we want it to be used. And in fact, lots of musicians have used it to, you know, instead of looking to the Southern Appalachians if they want to play kind of so-called folk or old-time music, you know, want to hear some Norwegian fiddlers, want to hear a Polish polka band, want to hear a big drum, you know, we've got all that stuff on this site. Okay, and I pulled out some photos from this region to kind of illustrate part of what I'm going to be talking about. And one of the sheets you have is this fieldwork project sheet. And maybe I should have made the print bigger, but when I've taught courses over the years, I've always had students do local fieldwork projects in their communities as their main project for the course, and I've tried to give them a sense of what to look for. And I'm not a believer in fixed questionnaires, but rather I'm a believer in open-ended kinds of interviews, but that are mindful of certain concepts or certain things that you're after. And so that's kind of what I've listed on here, and I'll be going through this a little bit, but just to give a glimpse in this region. This is Rosemary Corder Menard. She's deceased now, but in fact, well, not all of these. Several of these are deceased, and some are happily still with us. She grew up in a heavily German community between Boomer and Tilden. So that's where she's from. Neighbors to the Rubenzers and other folks from around that neck of the woods. This was my old neighbor when I was growing up, George Russell. He was the son of Irish immigrants who came by way of Canada, and of course, as you probably know, most people who settled this region came before there was Ellis Island or 1891. They just came, and they continued to come even after there was Ellis Island if they were coming from Canada, like a lot of the out around Dobie in this area, the French Canadians and the Irish, a lot of them came through from Quebec or Ontario, and George's family had been in Perth, Ontario. His folks then came to work in the woods in the Chippewa Valley, and George was a timber scaler. He was born in 1886, and I was lucky to know him since I was 5 years old. I was born in 1950, and he died in 1975, and I got to record him 73 or 74 73. When I got my master's in folklore, my dad gave me $50, and I spent half on beer, and the other half I bought a tape recorder and a cheap microphone. And the first person I interviewed was George Russell, because he was full of old jokes, and I'll get to some of them in a minute. This is Lenore Berg, who's still going in Barron. She's in her early 90s and played over the radio a lot back in the 50s with the Eric Berg Band, playing Scandinavian old-time music. I remember used to listen to them, and they were sponsored by the Indian Head Rendering Company, and had this classic ad. Say, Mr. Farmer, if you have any dead or down livestock, ship them to Indian Head Rendering. And now the Eric Berg Band will play the Shinakula Shadish.
Which is right, the Indian Head Rendering is right here.
Okay.
Part of our land here was part of that, and then the building is still.
Okay. This is Kong Zhang, a Hmong immigrant to the Eau Claire area, who adapted some old Gutsia or Hmong folk songs to electric guitar, and works at least when I met him, he was working the night shift at a, well, I can't remember what factory. And this is the Jacinto family, who at the time I met them 20-some years ago, and I'm not sure if they're still around. They were running Casa Mexicana here in Rice Lake and a little mercado behind it, and from them I learned about Santoribio Roma. They had little holy cards and bumpers and on their rearview mirror. He's a folk saint of Mexican immigrants, and just a few other folks over from around Ladysmith. Leo Heft, who made a trapper who made pounded ash baskets and beaver lure and so forth. From over around Grantsburg, Norwegian immigrant Sig Turland, who grew up making wooden shoes in rural Norway for barn chores and outdoor work and so forth. The Tomish family stripping a bunch of feathers to make down pillows and comforters, and Lil Dvorak Tomish using a little goose feather brush to put an egg white sheen on her kolaches. She's making those fantastic Bohemian or Czech pastries. And this is Margaret Hart with her granddaughter, Margaret Hart St. Croix Ojibwe. She's walked on now, but we'll hear a recording of her in a moment. Born in 1922, the same year as my dad, who's gone as well, and a little detail of her moccasin making. But on this sheet, what I'm interested in as a folklorist, and my work has always been project-based work. Sometimes I encounter stuff randomly, but usually, I'm interested in folk humor, joke-telling, anecdotes in this region, or the musical tradition of a certain group, or the occupational lore of a particular trade, or something like that. And the idea is then to do a radio program or an exhibit, or have people participate in a festival or something like that. And so typically people are going to they would have to be willing to be documented. I would give them a copy of the documentation, and they would get a copy of the ultimate production and so forth, except for a festival in which they would, be a participant. And so there's always a purpose and a kind of an openness about it, and a reciprocity. I don't pay people. I haven't paid people, but I paid them in kind, so to speak. And people have a willingness to participate or not. Occasionally I've had people say, no, I don't want people to know more about my carving, because then they're gonna bug me to want pieces, and I really don't wanna sell them, or I don't wanna take the time, or I already have things spoken for, or what have you, but almost everybody, is happy to participate. And one of the sheets I have is a standard release form that gives permission for nonprofit educational use. The idea is, if somebody's going to make some money off of this, that's beyond their expenses, production expenses, then those artists should be compensated, and they have copyright of their own material. But typically the stuff I work on, requires some external funding, and you don't make anything. It's fundamentally it's subsidized, and you break even, and the idea is to make it available to the public.
So,
yeah.
reciprocity, would that be like giving them a copy of?
Yeah.
I don't know what.
Yeah. So like so with the film, that's on the Ironworkers Union site. We also put it on a free, it's on a site called Folklore, so it's freely accessible online. But I gave DVDs to each of the people who were involved, and also we premiered the show at the locals, one of their meetings. The radio show, well, this was done back in the day of cassettes, 88 through 92. Sent everybody a cassette, let them know in advance when their show would be on the air, and so forth. Everybody who participated in this, I sent out about 70 copies of this book. So yeah, it means, and then they get the copy of the interview log, and the particular interview, stuff like that. And not every photo, because some of them are crappy that I take, but the good ones. Sorry. Keeps wanting to play both.
First day, they bring the
All right. Where am I? So as a folklorist, I'm interested in what you might call expressive culture. The traditional art of ordinary people, or their arts, and so that means verbal stuff, sayings, especially stories that could be true stories, personal experience stories, or they could be legends somewhere between truth and fiction, or they could be tales, jokes especially, and sometimes it's murky, some of the boundaries between one and another. I'm also interested in musical traditions, instrumental tunes, but also songs. One of the Grammy nominations I got reissued, there's actually a copy of it over there, Folk Songs of Another America. There were field recordings made for the Library of Congress in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan in 25 different languages, made for the Library of Congress in the 30s and 40s. And they were never released except for a few of the English language ones. And so I was able to find people who were bilingual in the Loish dialect of Scots Gaelic, and in Ho-Chunk, and in very old archaic Quebecois French, and you name it. And so when we reissued these, we cleaned up the sound, digitized the stuff. I was able to provide digital copies to all of my translators, and then they wrote the English lyrics, translations down, and the original lyrics with some annotations if they were needed, and so forth. So I'm interested in songs, many languages. I'm also interested in customary practices. food, and festivals and events and games and seasonal observations and that sort of thing. And then in material stuff, handwork, quilts, carving, basket making, stuff like that. And I'm going to start out with stories. And since I've been doing this, well, I'm mostly archiving stuff and trying to make sure that stuff I did, gets accessioned somewhere, because there's a lot of work behind that, and I'm 75 years old, so I'm not actively going out and sort of being dropped into an area not knowing exactly what I'll find, and working 12-hour days for 4 or 5 days to do a bunch of mad documentation on a very short budget, usually with a timeline for a production. I just don't want to do that anymore. But when I started out recording, as I mentioned, I bought a cassette recorder, early 1970s, and an external mic. And the mic is really important, I think, even if it's a cheap mic. To get the microphone near where the sound is coming from, instead of recording the sound of a room, or back the early cassette recorders, you could record just by turning it on, but the machine would hear more of the machine than it would of the voice, and so just having a little mic that was a little bit away from the machine. And I had a cheapie, I didn't even have a mic stand, but I would bring some masking tape and tape it to a bottle of beer or something on the table, so it was kind of aimed at the person. And as I said, the first person I interviewed was my old neighbor, George Russell, and at this time he had moved actually to Bruce, and he was living in Bruce, and that's also where his old hired man was, Jerry Booth, who was a really great old guy. And one day we went up into the Blue Hills and went and looked at some old homestead, which prompted George to tell a story. And what I did with him, I made a list of stories I'd heard from him over the years, and we sat down in his kitchen, and I just started asking him for particular stories. I didn't just say, tell me a story or tell me a joke, because the person's mind will go blank. I said, tell me that one and tell me that one. And do you know any about Ole and Lena? Do you know any about Pat and Mike, the Irishman and stuff like that? So I'll play a little bit, and you can hear the sound isn't too bad for more than 50 years old with kind of crappy equipment, especially that mic.
Well, in the early days, there was a settler settled out in the hardscrabble country. Oh, it was rocky and tough and rough. And as the country opened up, there was a minister who was going to build a church out in the open, and the settlers were scarce. So to get some money, he had to visit them all. And he went away out in hardscrabble to visit this settler out there. And the fellow that settled in the hardscrabble had worked hard and cleared up quite a nice farm. And the minister was congratulating him on how well he done. And he said, "You and the Lord have done a wonderful job in here." "Yes, but you ought to see it when God had the loan." Now that's all good. That night come over this country, and they were very green. There was a lot of tools they used in the United States that they didn't know what they were for. So they were walking out through the country, and there was a father and his son sawing wood with a cross-cut saw. And one would pull it, the other would pull it, and Mike thought that the old man was trying to take it away from the kid. So he went over and pulled it away from the old man and handed it to the boy.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great story, and as a kind of a nerdy folklorist, one of the things I do when I the text of that joke is in this. So Ole says to Lena, and you know, we use that title because Ole and Lena jokes are kind of well known, but this actually has German and French Canadian, Ojibwe, Polish, Finnish, lumber camp jokes, small town jokes, farm jokes, you know, the whole array. I tried to, I did a lot of field work, especially between the early 1970s and the mid 1980s with a lot of different communities recording jokes and stories, and the ones that really had a kind of a regional substance are the ones that went in there. And in the back there's a lot of small print, and that second joke about Pat and Mike, you know, that goes back to Europe. There are a number of stories about rural tricksters. One was a German guy named Till Eulenspiegel, who's associated with making fun of, he was a wandering homeless or migratory worker in Germany about the time of the peasant wars of the early 16th century, and as the Protestant Reformation was just getting together. And the stories were about him making fools of the priests, the wealthy landowners, the burgomeisters, and so forth. And in one, he's a worker, and he's told not to engage in disputes on the job, and so what he does is he sees someone pulling, or two men pulling a crosscut, and he actually cuts it in half with a big maul and hands one half to each of them. And I also heard that version from a Finnish guy named Gus Pietala in the UP who lives right around Bruce Crossing in the western UP. So it's one of these stories that kind of gets around. And just songs I'm also interested in. And this, I worked in 1985 on a project with some funding from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Wisconsin Arts Board to document German music in Wisconsin. And one of the people we visited was Rosemary Korger. She married a French guy, Menard, of the Menards, the giant stores. But when she was young, she used to play fiddle and along with and sing along with one of her sisters, and she knew some songs German songs in both English, made translations, and in German. And you'll hear, this is a clear recording. This was made with a reel-to-reel tape and a higher quality microphone.
Ferdinand, you think you're smart, wearing your pants of bright blue. We just can't help but laugh a bit. Ferdinand, we still love you. And then in German, Ferdinand, wie schön bist du, mit dein blauen Hosen, aller Mädchen lacht dir zu. Ferdinand, wie schön bist du.
Okay, thank you, Rosemary. And so, this is on that fieldwork project sheet. These are examples of verbal and musical lore. So as a folklorist, I'm interested in people who practice and sustain this, which doesn't mean they keep things the same. There's always going to be some kind of variation and change, whether it be updating an old story to fit a contemporary context, or a context that was contemporary at one time for George Russell with the crosscut saw, and Pat and Mike, the Irish coming over, and Rosemary innovated by doing an English translation or learning that so it could be accessible bilingually, which is pretty common. And then, I also try to look deeper into the background of those particular traditions. And they include, of course, also, customary stuff like seasonally, the Tomishes, you butcher some geese in the winter, and you'd strip the feathers, and then they would get together. They had to do this when they were kids, and they kept it up with their siblings and spouses. You'd have a whole bunch of the particular, the downy parts of the goose feathers, and then they would separate them from the quill. They'd have a big pile, and once you made them, then you could have the makings of your pillows or comforters. But it was also a social occasion. One of those earlier photos I showed of the Polish ladies singing in a choir, they grew up stripping feathers up near Ashland, and that was a time when they did it. It was all women, and that was a time for storytelling. And they told me a story about one time there was a witch who didn't want a certain couple to get married, and so just before the wedding, she walked around them and made some kind of a magic circle and said some sort of words, and anyways, they told several stories about this witch that they heard from back in Poland, that they heard from their elders while they were hanging out. You didn't get that. I got handouts here, so maybe you could pass some of these out. So with the customary practices, there are certain occasions when you do certain practices that are sometimes linked to the season, but other times it's kind of when you can get together. And then there's the material stuff, obviously, making food, making moccasins, making wooden shoes and other carved objects. He's got Sig has a Viking ship here, and he's got some spoons and lefse turners. And Leo Heft principally made baskets, but of a lot of different designs out of pounded ash. So I want to try to document those, and especially that means not only making sound recordings, but with customary and material stuff. You want to do photography, and then of course you can interview and ask people about them. And then the next thing on the sheet, you want to know about the so-called folk, the individual, the person. And typically, when I would interview someone, I try to demystify the equipment, and they'd know about the purpose, and then I'd start with an interview. This is Jim Leary, and I'm at such and such a date, and I'm with so-and-so on a project for whatever the project was, and we're going to talk about blah, 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 and I usually tell them in advance that that's what I'm going to say at the beginning, make an announcement, and then the first thing I'm going to do is ask them to tell me when and where they were born and where they grew up and how they learned to do what they do. And so that means that the interview is intended to get a sense of who they are as a human being, but especially in relation to the cultural traditions that they're practicing. And I kind of think of these as artistic autobiographies of a sort, because if you're interviewing someone, I mean, you you can interview them about all sorts of things. We've done all kinds of things in our lives, but that would, it would take many days and many hours to even scratch the surface of that. So usually, interviews I did, they'd be an hour to maybe sometimes as much as 3 hours with a person. You take a break in those longer interviews. But I always would have a notebook. That first slide when I was with Joe Ackley, the Ojibwa drum maker, I had a pen and a notebook because when I asked that basic question, tell me when and where you were born, where you grew up, and how you learned to do what you do, I don't want to interrupt someone if they're composing that and telling me some really cool stuff, but it's fairly common for people to say, I learned it from my uncle or my dad or my mother or my grandmother or something. They won't name the person. I don't know, sometimes roughly when that's happening. There are a lot of details, or they'll use a word maybe in a language other than English or something like that, or they'll mention a place, and maybe I won't know quite how to spell that. So I just make little short notes, and then I can come back to that later and get those details. So that's fairly typical. But what am I after? I want to know like I say, some basics about their life, and that's important, of course. If you're doing an exhibit, you want to do a little sign. Who is this person? And if you just ask them about what they're doing, but not how they learned it, or who they are, or where they are, and what they've done for a living, or then you need to go back and ask them that. So I try to get it the first time. But then I'm interested in, as I say, I don't do specific questionnaires, but I have these conceptual things. So I'm interested in the relationship between them, the so-called folk, and the lore, their material or musical or verbal or customary practices. And so part of that is repertoire, what does Sig Turland make? He grew up and made these functional wooden shoes, but later on he made like miniature Viking ships and so forth. And Margaret Hart was a moccasin maker. Some of them were for everyday use, but some were funeral moccasins for the deceased person to walk the spirit road over 4 days. And there are certain ways in which you have to make those moccasins, and there's some traditions about how you decorate them. Some say you can't have anything that's all the material has to be natural on it. So you can't have like plastic beads on the moccasins or something like that if you're going to go into the spirit world. And so there's that. But she also she actually and maybe I forgot to play this.
Are her moccasins in the Smithsonian? Is that, I'm trying to figure out if that's Cindy's mom.
Okay. Some of her moccasins are at the...
Is it that lady? Miss Nolok on the wall?
Oh.
See that Miss Gobeneshe? Is it her?
No. Margaret, this was a project that I did when the Wisconsin Folk Museum was still going. Although I was a professor at UW-Madison for about 15 years, for much longer than that, I was kind of a gig worker on different projects, and sometimes affiliated with organizations. There was a little museum in Mount Horeb called the Wisconsin Folk Museum, and we did a woodland Indian traditional artist project.
I think it's her.
Is it her?
I think it is. I have to see if it gives her maiden name on here, or,
Her, yeah.
I'm pretty sure it's her.
Wow.
She's from Sand Lake, isn't she?
Yeah.
Yes, they're coming.
I've met her
Okay.
a long time, she's passed, I think, now.
Yeah, she's been
I
gone
met, I
for
met her a few
quite
years
while.
ago.
If it's the same lady, her daughter volunteers here.
Cool. Well, her daughter, this was a project, this was a project we did for the Wisconsin Folk Museum. And actually, this was one of the few times we paid people, in part because of the fraught relationship between white people and indigenous people, white people taking things from them. And so that project, at the time, I was a gig worker, but I wrote these grants and I paid myself $300 a day, which usually meant pretty long days that I worked. And so we paid, it was a project focused on Native people who participated in apprenticeship programs in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, and Iowa, where they were, older people passing on they were paid a small stipend, $2,000 or something for materials, and didn't really cover their time to pass on their skills. And we tried to work with, we worked with about 16 people, and we paid each of them $900. $300 to be interviewed by me, which took a good chunk of a day. The interviews were 2 to 3 hours long. $300 to be photographed, having their work photographed and making stuff that they do. And I worked with, I did some photography myself, but we also hired someone who I worked with before. And then we paid them $300 for reviewing the interview transcription that I'd done. And in some cases, there were things that I stuff in Anishinaabe that or Ho-Chunk that I wasn't sure if I spelled it right, and I wanted to make sure I got it right. And in some cases, they had additions that they wanted to make. And then we actually purchased materials from them for an exhibit. And the Wisconsin Folk Museum eventually went under. It's a long story, but we made an argument. The director of the museum was fired by the board for fiscal adventurism. But we made the argument that the collections had been purchased largely with public money, and so they should go to a public institution. And actually, her moccasins and all the artifacts went to the Wisconsin Historical Society, and they were extremely pleased to have a collection of pieces made by indigenous people from Wisconsin, where they knew the provenance of it, and they knew a lot about the artists, because a lot of the stuff they had were from Parsons Trading Post in the Dells, or some wealthy collector who picked stuff up at a basket stand, or
Not as authentic.
Pardon me?
Not as authentic.
Well, I mean, it could be authentic in terms of how it was made and who made it, but you just don't know.
Not
You get it.
You don't know who made it. Yeah.
So Margaret was the older sister. I just quick Googled it.
Oh.
And she was the one who actually taught her how to do it, but they were together in the 70s and 80s, known for making their moccasins.
Oh, very cool. Yeah. I know Margaret loved being at Fort Follovan, if I'm pronouncing that right.
That's us.
Yeah, she used to demonstrate there, and she told me, she told me that. Well, let's listen to a little bit of her voice, because this is one thing about these recordings. I love the voices of people. George Russell, I played earlier those stories. You don't hear anyone talking like that anymore. It sounds like that. And Margaret was, I was kind of amazed, my dad was born in 1922, Margaret was born in 1922, but she was born in a wigwam, and they were still, to some extent, following a seasonal way. She was a descendant of Little Pipe, who bought homestead land on Sand Lake, you know, at a time when well, the St. Croix were sort of, you know,
We probably have a picture of the wigwam she was born in, because Cindy was looking out there and she says, that's my grandparents
Wow.
and that's their wigwam.
wow,
And so that would have been her
Wow.
parents and her parents.
And they were raised by their grandparents.
Yeah.
okay. This is,
First day,
Say
they
what?
bring their rice home.
Dad's.
They come in early. And right away they scorch it while somebody else is getting ready to trash it. They used to wear long moccasins too. And they go right up to their knees, these moccasins. And they tuck their pants inside of those moccasins. And they would get in these holes with the deer hide. And they would move their feet in there to take the husks out. And when they get done, the women, they fan it with birch bark baskets. And right away, they cook it. Whoever is the first one cooks the rice first, they all come and eat at the feast. They have a big feast. Some of them 2 families in one camp. And each one gets their rice done, they each have a feast. Every one of them. And that's the first day of rice.
okay. The sound is really good on this, and you know, I can talk later if you want about equipment, but you know, I bought years ago, I bought a kind of a cheap tripod stand and you know, a pretty good mic, and that recording was actually made with old DAT, digital audio tape, back in 1994. I've since moved up. I've got a little Marantz digital recorder, and I didn't haul out the cables, but it connects with cables to the mic. And you know, what I like about this is if you're interviewing someone for a couple hours, you know, you don't want to be holding a mic up. Your hands are free to take notes, and sometimes I've interviewed situations where, you know, like joke tellers or musicians exchanging songs, you can just kind of swing it around on the boom without making a lot of mic noise and stuff like that. But wonderful clarity to that, and to get back to this little sheet here, you know, I was mentioning repertoire, and that's, you know, that's a common term. The range of stuff that they do. George Russell, the joke teller, he told lumber camp jokes, and he told jokes about the farm, and he told numerous anecdotes about his German, Bohemian, Irish, and French Canadian neighbors, and he told Ole and Lena jokes, and you know, that was kind of his joke repertoire. You know, some of the musicians, Lenore Berg, she's Norwegian, but she married a Swede, so she played a lot of Scandinavian stuff, but you know, she knew some German, Polish tunes and so forth, as well as some kind of stuff that would be in a country western repertoire, pop music. So you know, there's a kind of a range, and some are locally grounded, and some are acquired through media or from afar, or touring performers, or syndicated radio broadcasts, or records, or whatever. But people have you know, they have a certain repertoire. And then there's, you know, transmission. How do you learn what you do, to do what you do? We've already had some discussion of people that Margaret taught, and here she is with her granddaughter. And Margaret, when I interviewed her, she talked about learning all kinds of things from her grandmother and her grandfather. She used to go around with her grandmother seasonally to gather you know, all kinds of natural materials to weave mats and to and also to learn how to, you know, tan hides and local rice and all that sort of thing. And then there's the question of aesthetics. Pretty much everyone will have an idea of who's a good singer, what makes a good singer, what makes a good joke teller. And one guy, old Polish guy, Leo Garski, told me, he said, I asked him what makes a good joke teller, what makes a good joke, and he said a good joke is good in itself. Some people can tell a joke better than others, but you have to like the person who's telling the joke. Don't be an asshole when you're joking. So it's important to get a sense of you know, what their aesthetics is, or what their community's aesthetics are. You know, Leo Heft was really proud of his baskets, and I didn't include this image, but he would have little plates stamped with his name as the basket maker that he would put on the basket. And Lil was proud of her kolaches, and actually they did have, I think, I don't know, was at the fair, or maybe they had a contest at the in Hagen at one of their Czech events where she might have won a ribbon for her kolaches. I'm not sure. She also had a sense of what makes a good pirko, one of these feather brushes that's made from the goose quill and feather for, you know, use like a little whisk of sorts, or a little pastry brush. And, you know, she had certain ideas about the kind of twine that you used and how you would cut and trim the quills. And so, you know, it's important to know about those aesthetic kinds of things. And obviously, context. All of this stuff happens in a context. Leo grew up near Ladysmith, in an area where there were North Germans, there were Kashubs, and you know, there are different Poles as well from up around the Baltic Sea, and there's some Slovaks there. It was an area, for example, they were Polish Jews. I know it was an area that was targeted by the Ku Klux Klan in the 20s, when they were targeting Catholics and Jews especially. And I remember there was a guy named Cohen who had a dry goods store in Ladysmith, and his he could speak Polish and German and English, and was good at dealing with kind of the larger kind of Yankee power structure of the community, and so he was often a resource for the local immigrants. And when the Klan was targeting them as well as him, he put up a sign in his store: why pay $5 a year to join the Klan when you can get a sheet at Cohen's for 99 cents? I mean, that's one example of context. But Sig Turland, when he was growing up in rural Norway, making wooden shoes, doing handwork was something you did during those long winters when you couldn't do, I mean, you'd feed your livestock and so forth. But then it was, you know, it was dark, you'd be indoors, and you know, you do handwork. and this was one of the things that he could do as a young kid to contribute to the family well-being and also pass the time. But the context changed when he was an immigrant. You know, he didn't need to make shoes for everyday use, but in his retirement, you know, he wanted to do something, and in a moment we'll get to meaning or significance, but these were no longer functional or utilitarian, they were symbolic, you know, they were an expression of ethnicity and so forth. And then he also made, you know, these, it's hard to see, but these miniature Viking ship with the dragon on the prow to scare off evildoers. So there's a context to this. George Russell, as I said, was born in 1886. The old guy who told the joke, and his folks were immigrants, like Pat and Mike. The Irish were immigrants, kind of standard or stock characters like Ole and Lena, or Ole and Sven and Nina. And then he lived grew up on a farm with mostly Czech or Bohemian and French Canadian, but also some German neighbors. And then he'd worked in the woods as well, as I said, as a timber scaler. So a lot of his stories were linked to that particular context, and sometimes they had esoteric references in it that you wouldn't necessarily get unless you were, he told, I'm going to run out of time, but yeah, he told a long joke about a Norwegian who was harassed by Swedes, and I'm just doing a very truncated version of it, and he'd insulted a bunch of Swedes at a tavern after drawing his pay from the lumber camps because they'd been harassing him while they were all working together. And then he staggered to his boarding house, but he passed out before he got there, and he was fell into a hog pen. And early in the morning, it's kind of foggy like it was this morning, he looks up and sees this big ugly face, and he says, "Er du svensk?" And the reply is, "Forsk." So, are you Swedish? Are you Svensk? And Norse, Norwegian, okay. So you know, there's a context to that stuff, and some of it is historical, a certain time era, some of it's cultural, having to do with interrelationships between different cultural groups and cultural significance. And some of it's situational. I mentioned that first story about the preacher trying to raise money and praising the farmer, and George he was prompted to tell it when he and Jerry Booth and I went in Jerry's four-wheeler up in the Blue Hills, and we were looking around at some old haunts, and we came on this old homestead where the log house had kind of fallen in, and the fields were, you know, overgrown with brush and so forth, and it prompted George to you know, think about that particular story. And so, you know, some of these things, well, it's important if one's doing documentation, you know, to think about where these traditions are being practiced and when and what's their implications and what's going on at the time and where do they come from. So that's context. And then there's, you know, there's performance. How is someone putting things across? And sometimes that's, you know, it has to do not only with how you sing or your style when you're dancing, or the way in which you pace yourself and maybe use mimicry, different voices in telling a joke or a story, but it can also have to do with layout, how you lay out your kitchen, how you lay out your workshop, and so I'm often interested in how things are done, and that could be, if it's verbal stuff, you know, linguists refer to as paralanguage, you know, tone and voicing. You know, my dad was really good at, I mean, he could, he born in 1922, died in 2009, but grew up in Rice Lake in the 20s and 30s, and he could, Irish was largely our heritage, so he could do a kind of an Irish accent. He could do Norwegian, he could talk like an old German, he could talk like a French guy, and it's all because he heard all these different people speaking English as a second language from all these backgrounds growing up, and he enjoyed that. And so I, you know, some people are, if they're good storytellers, they're paralanguage, using that kind of voicing and tone and pacing, and sometimes gestures like I'm doing and we all do. Sometimes gestures are a key part of a performance of you know, music or storytelling, but also process is part of a performance. You know, what are the stages or steps if you're making something? You know, how is it made? Where do you get your material, and where you start, and how do you modify stuff and put it together? So you know, that's part of the documentation. And then finally, there's, well, almost finally, there's function and use. You know, do you do it to entertain people? Do you do it to educate people? Do you do it to express your identity? I've got all these down here. Do you do it to keep people in line? You know, when I was a Boy Scout at Camp Phillips on Bear Lake, the Scoutmasters spread a story about the swamp man, and if we strayed from our campsite, and the swamp man would get us, and they would show us artifacts of like shredded Boy Scout uniforms and footprints on the edge of the camp, and you know, the idea was to try to keep us from running around. And of course, when I was 14 and a Boy Scout, some friends of mine and I, we made sure we got the most remote tent camp, and then, well, actually, some other friends at the Bethany Lutheran troop, they had the most remote ones, and I was in the St. Joe Troop 28, and we went on a path through the woods so we could smoke cigarettes and drink warm beer and play poker, unbeknownst to the Scoutmasters. I remember one time coming back with my friend Dave Stafford, who lives in Spooner now, and we heard this thrashing as we were coming, you know, going through the woods, coming toward us, and we thought, you know, it turned out to be a deer, but we both confessed to each other that we thought it was the swamp man. That was our first, well, we didn't do it, but that was our first thought. So anyway, you know, sometimes, or sometimes people, you know, people do practice some of these traditions to be noticed as a point of pride or accomplishment, and sometimes they sell what they make. There's an economic function, and a lot of times multiple functions are happening all at once. So, but it's something to be aware of. You know, why are people doing what they're doing? And then there's sort of the literal and the personal, the symbolic use. A lot of times people do stuff to, and I do stuff. I make, on St. Patrick's Day, I play Irish music all day. I start sipping Guinness a little bit after noon, and I make Irish food from scratch. You know, soda bread, and either I've corned some beef myself, or else I make a lamb stew, and then I make a special kind of a lemon pudding, and I think about my ancestors, and sometimes weep, and then we have a feast. And so, you know, that's an expression. I mean, to me, it means identity, but I'm connecting with other people, and there's symbolic elements to it, and all that. So I've thrown a whole lot of stuff at you, and you know, we've got about two minutes left. But some of the other sheets I gave are just examples. I've given some examples of photo log, audio logs, and also a sort of a consent form and a contact sheet, a kind of a master sheet that, you know, for such a documentation of such and such a person. And this is all, you know, archival material. And as I said, Tammy has, if she gets your email.
Yeah, I have the digital copy version of it, so I can email it to everyone that would be interested, so let me know.
Yeah. So,
Great.
so thanks.
Thanks.
I'll be hanging around all day, so if anyone has any specific stuff.
I could have listened all day. And plus in my head, I have a list of questions.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'm here.
So,